Down below here, though I think we didn't realize that the waters were very apt to turn to them. That might happen, has happened. And that the old idea of being baptized or reborn might actually cause the death of very good men. These waters of time have been dipped in a great deal of blood since then, from innocent Vietnamese blood to innocent American blood.
Father Daniel Berrigan is a poet and a Jesuit priest who defied the law as a means of dramatizing his opposition to the war in Vietnam. On May 17, 1968, Father Berrigan, his brother Philip, also a priest, and 7 other men and women entered the Selective Service Office at Catonsville, Maryland, and burned several hundred draft files with homemade napalm. The Catonsville Nine were later tried and convicted of destroying government property. On April 9, 1970, the date he was due to begin serving his prison sentence of 3.5 years, Father Berrigan went underground. He successfully evaded capture for 4 months. On August 11th, Father Berrigan was finally arrested by agents of the FBI on Block Island, Rhode Island.
First priest I'd ever been close to, Jesuit. I always thought the Jesuit was something out of the Middle Ages, for the 16th century. That's where the Jesuits were, and I never thought of a real live Jesuit, but here was one, and a poet to boot, and a marvelous man. And Hanoi, our experience in Hanoi, I guess, had a profound effect on him. I think it has a profound effect on all people who go there. And you must remember, we went there in early 1968 when the United States was still bombing the North and still bombing Hanoi. And there was something about that I think did a lot to Dan, because he spent a lot of time in shelters. And in fact, there was one scene that Dan wrote a poem about.
So we were in this shelter and very unexpectedly came on 3 children who were crouching in there too, against all expectations. And one of the elder children feeding rice to one of the younger ones. And I wrote this little verse within a couple of days and tried to read it later at our trial, to the great anger and discomfiture of the judge. But it seemed to sum up for me everything that Catonsville was about in one image, one reality. It's called Children in the Shelter. Imagine 3 of them as though survival were a rat's word, and a rat's death waited there at the end. And I must have in the century's boneyard heft of flesh and bone in my arms. I picked up the littlest, a boy, his face breaded with rice, his sister calmly feeding him as we climbed down. In my arms fathered in a moment's grace, the Messiah of all my tears. I bore, reborn, a Hiroshima child from hell.
And so when months later we were back in the States, and I read in the newspapers about what he had done at Catonsville, I was a little surprised, because it was a surprising event. But I wasn't that much surprised, because I knew that he felt, after coming back from North Vietnam, that somebody had to cry out in the streets, Somebody had to do something special, somebody had to keep doing something that would arouse the American people to even begin to sense what was happening, and what we were doing with our bombs, what we were doing with our silence, even those of us who weren't dropping the bombs. So I wasn't surprised. And he felt that burning draft records was a statement, a flaming statement.
May he make it possible through this action for others to live. May he make it more difficult for men to kill one another. We make our prayer in the name of that God whose name is peace and decency and unity and love. Amen. In 1967, I had a sense, only just under the skin, that I was at the end of something. I had been to Hanoi and seen the charnel house our military had made of a quite beautiful society. That Easter Sunday, on returning, I visited a boy in Syracuse, New York, who had immolated himself in front of the cathedral. He later died. And then there was horror upon horror, Martin Luther King's murder and so on. Suddenly, I saw that my sweet skin was hiding out behind others. So with 8 other felons, I went into a draft board in Catonsville in May of that year, removed about 300 draft files, and burned them with homemade napalm, under the utterly absurd and totally un-American assumption that it is better to burn papers than children. We regret very much, I think all of us, the inconvenience and even the suffering that we brought to these clerks here. It was done so quickly, and we had hoped that they wouldn't be so excitable over a few files. It's very hard to bring home to people exactly what they're doing by being custodians of such files.
I was sitting at my desk doing my work, and these 2 ladies were in the office with me. I noticed a gentleman came up in the hall outside there, and I said, "Yes, sir, may I help you?" And so then right on top of him came another man. And then he started to come in. He looked in here, and then he looked over in there. And he said, they walked into the office, and I said, "Well, what can I do for you?" And with that, then all the rest of them came, all of a sudden, quickly. And the one man with the trash burner, he went around to my files and stood there and started dumping files into this trash burner. And this one, I tried to prevent it, and this one man attempted to stop me from doing it. And he did succeed.
So when we decided that those files had no right to exist, as I say, we were trying to be profoundly historical about the thing. What kinds of property, protected by what kinds of law, actually serve human life? This is a question that cannot be evaded in wartime. For us to go in there, therefore, is in a long line of dissent, a long line of overtly illegal activity that goes back in the West to Old Testament prophecy, more nearly to our own times, to the activity of Jesus himself in the world, his invasion of the property of the occupying power, even the property of the temple.
4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9.
What would you say is going to happen to your office here? Has this seriously disrupted your service?
Yes, it has seriously disrupted it. It really has. It's going to take hours and hours and hours of intense, hard labor to reconstruct and bring back all of these. And it's doing a great injustice to the boys themselves, because many instances these boys have gone to a lot of trouble to get doctor's statements, which cost them a lot of money. These things are all inside of these files.
It was certainly with a great heave of relief that we were able to say afterward, it's all over, and no one was hurt, and this really seemed to have been something different than what was current. Almost, as many people said, gradually, like a new day of creation. Because before us, at least in this century, that kind of thing not happen, you know? That there was a nonviolent, explicit attack upon property as an attempt to vindicate human life in the midst of, say, the idolatries paid to property and the absolute cheapening of human life that war spells.
And he knew, you see, he knew that it made people uncomfortable, as it still makes people uncomfortable, breaking the law, burning draft board records, setting fire to something, because we have, and I guess we have, not only in this country, but in the modern world, we have this fetish about property, about things, much more than we have about people. And I guess that's one of the points he wanted to make. People are more important than pieces of paper. People were being burned and killed. I guess it's like Garrison, not far from here, in the 1835, William Lloyd Garrison burned the Constitution, which upset people. You know, don't burn the U.S. Constitution. And Garrison did it to make a point about slavery, and I guess Dan was doing something like the same thing.
Well, I don't want to become complicated about it. We went in there and destroyed a few files, placed ourselves in a very interesting position with regard to communicating with our society, hung around until the Keystone Cops arrived, stood trial in a way that was very much according to their rules and expectations of us. We were very straight, trousers were pressed. We didn't go in for any of the delightful antics of the later Chicago trials. We played their rules, which I must add, by way of a footnote, I would never do again.
He was brought up in the American tradition, even the American liberal tradition. The American liberal tradition is, it's all right to commit civil disobedience, maybe, but if you do, you should take your punishment. Sometimes people add, like a man. You take your punishment, you go to jail. That's the sporting thing to do, it's the right thing to do. It's what Socrates did. Socrates said, I'll accept the punishment on the supposition, and this is Socrates' supposition, that basically this government is a decent government. Athens has made a mistake with me, they've done something wrong, there's a flaw, but fundamentally it's a decent government to which I owe some allegiance. And I guess Dan Berrigan said, I've watched what the government has done to human beings, our brothers, because the world consists of our brothers, in Vietnam, and I don't believe our government is behaving like a decent government, and I don't believe we owe it allegiance. And I think maybe he was going back to the idea in the Declaration of Independence, which is an even older American idea than the idea that you take your punishment for civil disobedience, and that is that when a government becomes destructive of certain very fundamental things like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, then that government does not deserve the allegiance of its people anymore. Anyway, I'm just trying to recapture in my mind what he was thinking about at that moment when he decided, no, I'm not going to go to jail. This government doesn't deserve that kind of subservience.
During the time he was in hiding, Father Berrigan changed his location often. He stayed with 37 different families in 10 eastern and midwestern cities. 10 days prior to his arrest, Father Berrigan was interviewed by Lee Lockwood for NET in an underground location, an apartment in New York City. Well, Father Dan, you've been underground for some time now. What's it like to be underground in the United States of America?
Well, I'd say that it looks as though it could go on forever. It looks good enough, looks useful enough for the movement. I think it's been an enormous opportunity to work up close with people, with small groups, to meet with the media, to reflect and meditate, to do a great deal of reading. In fact, to do everything that I was doing before, but do it squared, do it twice as intensely, twice as much.
How long have you been underground now? How long is
Well, it's going into its 4th month now. And I can remember very vividly in the beginning when if I could have promised myself 1 week or 2 weeks, I would have been very content. So I'm delighted at that. My delight, of course, is always mitigated and even embittered by the fact of the war and the fact that whatever one can do is so small, but one does what he can. It's all right.
I understand that you've got something planned for tomorrow. Do you want to tell us?
Well, it's a very simple little project. Tomorrow, for the first time since I went underground, I'm going to preach in a church, in an urban church. And I'm doing that with deliberation, with understanding of the danger involved. I'm doing it very simply because I haven't been allowed so far, I haven't had the opportunity to be in a church. I think I've been preaching the gospel in other ways, at least I hope I have. But I want really, I want to be with a group of worshiping Christians, not necessarily Catholics. And I want to refer to the New Testament, and I want to relate it to what we have done, and to invite people in as practical and simple and direct a way as I know to consider this, even though they are shocked by it.
You think they will be shocked by it?
Well, I predict it. I think, you know, this tremendous cleavage among peoples is occurring also among the Christian communions as a result of the war. And I feel that very deeply. I feel that there are many people who are in despair over me and are extraordinarily scandalized by what I have done. I feel at times in great despair over Christians.
We live in extraordinary times, and in extraordinary times, we must be ready to take advantage of suddenly emerging possibilities. So it is with us this morning. We have a visitor. For reasons that will become obvious with a little reflection, it was not possible to anticipate his arrival amongst us in advance. For reasons that are equally obvious, he will have to leave directly following the sermon. He doesn't want to have to do this. He is a person who would like nothing more than to be able to come under normal circumstances without this paraphernalia and talk to us about the state of this nation and the state of the Christian church within this nation. As a person, I'm sure he'd like to stay all afternoon and into the long hours of the morning. But we no longer live in a time and a place where that is possible. Perhaps someday it will be possible once again in this nation. So now, if you would join me in welcoming our guest, our visitor, Father Daniel Berrigan. Will you bring us our message?
Dear friends, I must thank first of all so many who have made this morning possible, that I should be in a church with my fellow Christians in such circumstances as my life has brought me to. I come to you really in the name of all those who have said no to this war, from prison, from the underground, from exile, from the law courts, from death itself. I do not hesitate to say, in the light of the readings we have heard from Scripture, that I come to you also in the name of the unborn, to present on an ordinary Sunday morning to fellow Christians the scandal of one who lives outside the law, the added scandal of one whose brother, also a priest, is in federal prison, the first political prisoner in our history who was a priest. To present you with the further scandal that I have refused to submit before the law and to go to prison myself, and that I am hunted and underground for the duration of the war at least. To suggest to you that my life may open questions also for yours, for your families, for your work, for your attitude to human life and death, especially the death of children and the innocent. Dear friends, I believe we are in such times as make such demands upon us also. I believe we are in such times as make it increasingly impossible for Christians to obey the law of the land and to remain true to Christ. And this is the simple word that I bring to you as a brother in Christ. I bring it with the full consciousness that in bringing it I increase my own jeopardy. But for my brother and myself, the choice is already made. We have chosen to be powerless criminals in a time of criminal power. We have chosen to be branded as peace criminals by war criminals. This is how we have tried to read the simple words that you heard this morning. This is how we have tried to read and translate and embody in our own lives the will of God. To respond to the voices of those great men and women who speak to us out of eternity, out of the past, but most of all, out of today. Out of today's prisons and exile and underground and death itself. Good men and women are increasingly perplexed. They listen and their hearts are sore with the continual ill news of the daily press and television. They find themselves cornered by life with fewer and fewer decisions to take in regard to conscience. They ask again and again, night and day, what can we do? A Christian can confront the law of the land, that law which protects the war makers even as it prosecutes the peacemakers. The Christians can refuse to pay taxes. They can aid and abet and harbor people like myself who are in legal jeopardy for resistance, along with AWOLs. They can work with GIs on bases, helping those young men to awaken to the truth of their condition and their society, in coffee houses or in hospitality in their own homes. They can organize within their profession and neighborhood and churches so that a solid wall of conscience confronts the death makers. They can make it increasingly difficult for local draft boards to function. There are 100 nonviolent means of resisting those who would inflict death as the ordinary way of life. There are 100 ways of nonviolent resistance up to now untried or half-tried or badly tried. But the peace will not be won without such serious and constant and sacrificial and courageous actions on the part of large numbers of good men and women. The peace will not be won without the moral equivalent of the loss and suffering and separation that the war itself is exacting. Dear friends, dear brothers, I thank you for being patient. I thank you for accepting me in this very brief span. I ask your prayers for all those who are in deep trouble with the law, who have had to face separation from families and friends and to forge new lives for themselves in such times. A very small price, indeed, for the death of a single child. May the peace of Christ, which is promised to the courageous and the patient and the cheerful of heart, be yours also. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well. Huh? We need your help. Thank you. Well, these are fine.
It was a surprise sermon to me because I thought that Dr. Raines would have be the main speaker, but of course we had a visitor, as he announced, and I think the emphasis was mostly on Father Berrigan's speech.
What did you think of Father Berrigan's sermon?
Well, I think he was very sincere. I think he brought the facts to the people. I assume that that he is very interested in the peace movement, and perhaps was because of his activities in the peace movement, he probably, I don't want to use the term unfrocked, but that's what I think happened.
You think that he was disciplined by the church?
That's what I thought, or else...
You think he was disciplined by the church?
That's what I would assume, that he was disciplined by the church because of his activities in the peace movement, perhaps. Or else he left the church, one of the... I don't know.
What do you think of his views about the war? What do you think about
I
them?
think they're very good, and I wish the war was over. I think we should all do what we can to make the effort to cause the war to drop or to cease. I had a grandson that was killed in the war, and of course I don't like war. My son was in the war, World War II war, for 5 years. He came home without a scratch, and I thought my grandson would do the same, but he didn't. So I don't like war.
I don't think anybody likes war.
No.
Do you sympathize with Father Berrigan's act of burning draft files and then running away from his jail sentence and appearing in situations like this in the underground?
Oh, I see that. I didn't quite understand the facts in the case. That is why in other words, he should be in jail. Is that the idea?
That's right. He's got a jail sentence hanging over him.
In another section of the country? Is he from another section of the country?
He's from the East.
Oh, I see.
Do you sympathize with that kind of action as a war protest?
No, I do not sympathize with the burning of draft cards. I think that's very un-American. And but that's his way of speaking, a way of sympathizing. I think there's other ways. Being a conscientious objector, I've read about they're sending these young men to camps and to other military camps where they are assigned different duties that
doesn't
will take
stop
out
the war. The point you made is that doesn't stop the war.
No.
What did you feel about Father Berrigan asking everybody to put themselves in jeopardy and to commit actions that are actually illegal in order to resist the war and bring it to an end?
That's his idea, and then he thinks it's right to do that. I can understand his point of view, thinking it is right to do those kind of things. But personally, I wouldn't do it myself.
But I believe in law and order first. I don't believe in breaking the law in any respect.
I agree with her. I don't believe in violence. I think that's wrong. But I wish everybody could sign a petition and say we do not want war, and the war would be over.
When John Raines spoke of an unexpected guest who could only stay for the sermon, I was trying to imagine whether he was speaking allegorically of Jesus Christ or who he was speaking of. So I was completely amazed that we could have this privilege.
How do you feel precisely about Father Berrigan's type of witness, the illegality?
Well, his is the kind of heroic witness that I wish I had the courage to do, but which seems so very removed from the kind of thing that a person can do and still function in middle-class society. It's a brave witness indeed.
Of course, that's what Father Berrigan was trying to get people like yourself to confront, the idea of going one step further and actually letting go of your middle-class position and your middle-class values and taking a chance, raising the ante. Do you feel that his sermon made you want to do that, or any chance that your life could change as a result of Father Berrigan's sermon?
I've made that decision quite a long time ago, really, that I want to be within rather than outside. His position was that a person has to be willing to lose friends and change his whole life for the kind of position that he's taking. And my own choice is to work within rather than from without. And I have only admiration for those who can take that kind of position, and it's possible that I should too.
In all your 50 years of church-going, have you ever had an experience similar to this one?
Nothing like it, no. And I wish we had more.
Were you surprised at Father Berrigan's appearance?
Yes, very much surprised.
And what did you think of his sermon?
To tell you the truth, I couldn't hear it. I have hearing devices, new ones, and I couldn't hear it. I just get a little now and then.
But you know who he is and what he stands for. Do you know anything about him?
No.
I see.
Well, who is it, Father Berrigan?
Father Berrigan, the priest who delivered the sermon this morning.
Well, I know that somebody told me he had been a priest.
I see.
And he's left the church?
No, he's still a member of the church.
Still a member of the church.
Yeah.
But he's one of the recalcitrant members.
Well, perhaps so.
He doesn't just agree with everything. There are a tremendous number of them today.
That Father Daniel Berrigan is a member of your province, is that correct?
That's true, sure. Yes. He's a member of the province, and I myself, I know Dan rather well. We were together at one time when he was teaching at Lemoyne. I was on the same faculty with him. And I was dean of Lemoyne College for a period of years there when Dan was on the faculty.
When was that?
That would have been in 1959 to 1963, during that period. And so I'm very fond of Dan, and he's a very good friend of mine. I have a great deal of admiration and regard for him, even when we disagree about things at times.
As Dan Berrigan's superior, Father Mitchell, how would you evaluate his performance as a priest and as a Jesuit?
Well, I think anyone who has ever known Dan or been closely associated with him can't help but be impressed by his tremendous concern for men, I think for Christianity, for the gospel. And even when one disagrees with Dan, and there are many who do, I think, they always see him really as someone who is evidently a man of the gospel and a man of God. He's a priestly person.
Have already checked with the parents, and they say that we should say something. It's one of those points at which we feel that silence is a great gift to everyone. I think that my brother and I have always mysteriously been marked by the presence of a baptism or a wedding or something heavily charged with the mystery of life as we entered upon new phases of our life. And this is also true tonight in the gift of this child who stands for all children, and in virtue of that for the children of Vietnam, the children of Brazil, the children of South Africa, all of those children whose chances we are trying to widen by an evening like this and what is to follow this evening. I am sure it would be entirely according to the hopes of the parents that everyone here would declare themselves godparents and human parents of this child, which by and large is the same thing. That is to say that incorporate into their hopes for one innocent and defenseless life would be the hopes of all, for all those who are victims of wrong power, wrong-headed and wrong-hearted power, which is crushing the innocent around the world. So that we accept such a child not into an abstract community whose existence is a matter of conjecture in the real world, of blood and tears, but that this child would be accepted here and would accept us here as those who might stand proxy for a human future. Shortly before his death, A.J. Muste, the man who never grew old, declared that the need of our country was for a foreign policy for children. We declare that again tonight, with the help of all those who stand for something except death as a social method. We baptize you, dear child, in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, and all of us. How's that? Amen. Thanks, Bill. Let me give you a kiss. Huh?
Yeah.
Right. Kiss, kiss. Kiss.
He's in good standing as a priest and as a Jesuit.
Yes. Oh, yes. Dan is in good standing as a priest and as a Jesuit.
What things you disagree with Dan on?
Yes, well, I do disagree with Dan on the particular method that he's chosen to dramatize his opposition to the war in Vietnam. I've never been able to see it. It seems to me to turn ultimately into an attack on the legal system. And I cannot see how that is in the long run going to be beneficial to anybody.
How do you stand in relation to the church itself, to your church?
Well, the Jesuits are, I would say, supportive to a degree. They're not exactly delighted. I'm sure that many of them are very puzzled. That's really my family within the church. That's why I bring that up. But they are certainly much more willing to go with the idea of a Jesuit underground than they would have been even a year ago, you know. After all, we have a long history of Jesuits in trouble with the state and the church. We've had Jesuits underground not only in modern Russia, but in Elizabethan England.
But never in the United
fleeing
States.
the law, never in the United States, regrettably. I wish we had begun this long ago. We've been more used to it now.
I think you could find priests with almost any opinion on on our civil life and our legal system and our political life and so on, and they express their opinion. And I think especially today, Catholics are able to see and know that priests do have various opinions and that this is not an official position of the church in any way. It is Dan Berrigan's opinion, which he is expressing.
I've heard from Dan, and he seemed in, as you said, in good spirits. And the flash I got of him on TV showed me that he seemed in good health. Much better health than I saw him when he left Cornell.
I'd like to ask you what you think personally of the actions which your two sons, Phil and Dan, have taken in resisting the war.
I feel I'm with them wholeheartedly. Because of these young boys that are slaughtered, leave home, and then come home to be buried. And a few that I've heard who did come back after their time was up are not clear about what they're fighting for. So I'm in hopes that their work has done some good. I mean Dan and Phil's.
Do you feel, as they do, that it is proper to break the law in showing your resistance to the war?
Yeah. Yes, I do, because it's not God's law.
How do you stand with the federal people at the moment? Do you think they're on your trail? Do you expect your life in the underground to be short-lived, or do you think you have some time ahead of you?
Well, I'm proceeding now on the very open assumption that this thing can go on. And I think that, we have a solid background now these months in order to show that. I think that we're able to show concretely that people are able so to organize their lives and so to organize their imagination and their resources that they're able to help in a way which will keep this thing going, you know.
You see yourself as a teacher for the movement.
Well, if that's a little bit too pretentious, I see myself as somebody who, from, let's say, a personal jeopardy, is opening up new ways for other people by way of invitation. They're invited in new directions as a result of my presence. They're invited to respond to this in a way that is really concrete in the lives they are leading, whether within their family, within their profession, within their church or synagogue, you know? To worship in new ways, to see themselves as teachers or doctors or lawyers in new ways, because so many of them are reaching personal and professional impasses anyway, and are finding very great difficulty in going ahead with the structures, the American structures as they are.
Well, I guess an underground requires it requires criminals, or as Dan Berrigan put it, criminals for peace, refugees from injustice. And then it requires people who will help them. And if the government continues to supply refugees and criminals by trying to put in jail those who act militantly against the war, those who commit civil disobedience, then I think more and more those people who who the government wants to put away are going to maybe follow Dan Berrigan's example. Some of them will, maybe many of them will. And I think that if they do, they will find people who will help them, as people helped Dan Berrigan. And to me, this is a sign of health in the American society.
Are you one of the people who helped Dan Berrigan when he was underground?
I don't think that kind of question should be asked, frankly, you know, and I don't think it should be answered because yeah, it's not a game, and it's not a drama, and it's not martyrdom. I don't think Daniel Berrigan did what he did in an act of martyrdom, and I don't think the people who helped him should treat it that way. And I don't think that's the kind of thing that should be talked about on television. I guess the only thing I would say is that I would help Dan Berrigan in every way I could, and I would help any refugee who was a refugee from injustice, somebody in that position, because the law, what we call the law, hunts down some of the best people in society, the people we need to really build the kind of country that we need. So my hope is that people will help in situations like this.
Do you mean to say that you feel that by raising the level of your own risk and your own jeopardy that you have a greater appeal or a sharper appeal to other people in terms of their raising their own level of commitment?
Well, I think that's exactly part of the struggle that we've had in these months since I've been under. It's an effort not merely to talk to many Americans through the media, but really to get to people I live with, people who harbor and who aid and keep me afloat and keep me in communion with others, to raise exactly these questions. That is to say, what is the virtuous man today, and what especially is his attitude toward the law when the law is being used by those in power to break the law of humanity?
Was Dan a very rebellious boy?
No. He probably was at times a little so, but as a rule, I can't say that he was. Juju?
No, Dan had kind of a rough time from Pop. Dan tended to be somewhat frail physically, and wasn't able to take his share of the outside chores and duties that my father would assign the rest of us. I'm talking again now about the farm where we lived. Consequently, he was, in a sense, forced into an interior role. That is, he would be in the house, he would be helping my mother with her chores around the house, and he would be doing a good deal of reading, and I'm sure thinking that the others of us didn't have you might say, an opportunity for. Whether or not we had the inclination is another matter, but Dan had a pretty rough time with Pop. And it's a mark of Dan's greatness that during my father's last days, when he was ill and even dying, Dan was, of all of us, the most solicitous and the most attentive. That's just the way Dan is.
The effect he had on me was a kind of effect that is very hard to measure, an emotional effect. Poetic effect.
His poetry is like himself. It is extemporaneous, and it is inventive and very unstructured. And I believe that if one may assume a time will come when history settles down and scholars look at all these matters, which is doubtful, that he will finally be remembered, perhaps more as a poet than anything else, and not as a fugitive or a felon or a burner of instruments of death.
Compassionate, casual is a good face. A good heart goes without saying. Someone seen in the street, or infinitely rare, once, twice in a lifetime, that conjunction we name brother or friend. Biology, mythology, cast up, clues. We grew together, stars made men by cold design, instructed sternly. No variance, not by a hair's breadth, in course and recourse. In the heavens, in our mother's body, by moon and month, were whole men made. We obeyed then, and were born.
He seems to have in his bones and inside of him, these images and those sounds that we only get at rare times. And in that way, he's made me feel things more deeply. Well, maybe I should say one other thing, and that is, he's made me aware of friendship. Do you know, it's very easy in large movements to forget about friendship. There were friends you had outside of movements, and then there's the movement, which is a kind of large amorphous thing. And what he made me aware of is that if any movement that's worth anything has to consist of friendships.
Decision to go underground. Tony Mullaney and Robert Cunnane are priests and members of the Milwaukee 14. They are among the more than 100 priests, nuns, and laymen who have been indicted for destroying draft files since Catonsville. Father Mullaney and Father Cunnane, both strongly influenced by Daniel Berrigan, have served their jail sentences and are now searching for new ways of resistance.
If you allow yourself to really listen to Berrigan, and that's not an easy thing to do because he's a threat, but if you allow yourself to listen to him, then you begin sharing, what he's experienced, and before you know, you're saying something like this, that, well, how do I respond, to this type of thing? And you find yourself getting deeper and deeper into resistance. See, the step from dissent to resistance is a very great step. It's, everything up to that point, from letter writing to, visiting congressmen, that's a pretty clear continuum. But then to step into the area of resistance, say through burning of draft cards and receiving draft cards, that's a much tougher step to take.
Yeah, I like Tony's, excuse me, I didn't butt in on you, but I like your point about listening to Dan, because there seems to be among a lot of people, whether on sort of one extreme or the other, one crowd says he's a nut, and they dismiss him. The other crowd says he's a prophet, and they dismiss him as well. I think the crowd that call him a nut are probably more honest than the ones that call him a prophet. He's an ordinary human being. He is a great poetic talent, but he's no different from you and from me. And this sort of saying he's a prophet, therefore I can never do what he does, is a beautiful cop-out.
Do you have any concrete knowledge, Father Dan, that your actions have really made a change or helped to make a change in the lives of individuals or groups of people with whom you've come in contact?
Well, I have a certain evidence of all that. You know, I think really the first evidence of anything really occurring in the lives of others is some evidence that some change has occurred to oneself, you know, and I'm quite certain that has occurred. I'm also reasonably confident, because of the way we have talked, the intensity with which groups of us have talked together, I'm reasonably confident that other people also find this as this combination of nonviolence and of you know, fidelity to one's actions, and of even the upping of the original jeopardy of our action, that they find that's moving, that means something to them, and they're willing to follow through on it.
We've both turned the corner, you know, and I think once you make that jump from dissent to resistance, that it's very, very difficult to withdraw, you know. Now, what forms the resistance will take is another problem, and in fact, I just wouldn't be willing to discuss them, even if my path were clear, because, you know, this is not 1968, it's 1970, and discussions of this sort are, because of the times, are not appropriate in this medium, I'm afraid. But the style of resistance is, you know, I've made my choice. So.
Yeah, it would seem that you're educated by jail and all that we went through, and it's almost like, you know, becoming a lawyer and then not practicing in a way. You know, you're almost in it, and you can't help but see, you know, the way things are, and that, you know, you're bound to it. At least it seems to me, if you try and stay a little bit honest with yourself, you're bound to at some future date to come in to something. You know, you just can't help it.
Certainly one problem, as I mentioned earlier, is the problem of nonviolence. I still feel this commitment. But I also feel a commitment to actions that are proportionate to the continuing insensitivity of national leadership. And it's very difficult to come up with a form of resistance that has those two qualities.
Do you feel that you're offering a kind of alternative to the weatherman type of underground operation?
Well, I don't know the inner workings of the Weathermen Underground. I don't think many people do. But I would like to say that I think that the society, in a kind of base and inhuman sense, needs the weathermen to be violent, and even secretly hopes that they will be, because the society, just as it needs an army, and in a sense needs someone to kill, also needs someone to be killed, needs someone to pursue, as it needs the mafia, needs the Ku Klux Klan, and needs the Panthers. And I would like to say also that I'm very anxious to have contact with the weathermen, and that I see whatever ministry I could have in the underground is also in their direction.
It's like no other period in American history when we had reform movements, because they were all sort of partial things. They were all based on the idea that something is wrong and we'll fix it up. You know, there's the race question, there's the Depression, there's the Spanish-American War, you know, but we'll fix that up. Basically, the country is okay, and the system is okay, and our system of government and our economic system, they're all okay, and our values are okay. And what's different now is that a lot of people are beginning to say, particularly young people, it's not okay. It's deeper than that. What we've been thinking about, what we've been cherishing, what we've been valuing, how we've been proceeding, what we've been doing with our wealth, the way we think about other people in the world, the way we think about ourselves, who we give power to, all of that has got to be changed. That's what going underground means, I think, is a statement about America, which is important today.
I sense a kind of straight line, or let's say even a crooked line, a line in nature, a line of a stream maybe, between those beginnings or stirrings of social understanding and where my brother and I and the other Catonsville people stand today. The cost of real change is going to be at least as deep and as bloody as the cost of immobility. And that's indeed a very, very hard price. But I guess a few have to be willing to pay it, at least in principle.
right after his seizure at our house in the next days, we were visited by a good many of our neighbors expressing their interest and concern and overwhelmingly their support for our hospitality, for Dan, but they came, many of them, it seemed to me, in a sort of a spirit of condolence, the way you might go to a house where there had been a death. And that bothered me and still bothers me because nobody has died here. And Dan is in prison, but he is not dead, and he is not really silent.
You have any comment, Father, at all?
Good to be here.
What are you doing out on Block Island?
Well, I was writing and reading and meditating. Exactly what I'll be doing in jail.
What are your future plans?
Resistance.
I would say that our hope isn't placed in the conversion of those who have power now. It's placed in something arising very mysteriously from very different forces. You know, from Chicago to Saigon and Hanoi, and even Catonsville. But the form of all that, I think, awaits upon the enduring of all that. And for me to announce some sort of clear vision of the next year even would be totally absurd. I don't know if I'm going to survive the next year. And I don't know if you are either.
Father Dan Berrigan is now serving his 3.5-year sentence in the federal penitentiary at Danbury, Connecticut. Under federal regulations, Father Berrigan is prohibited from meeting with members of the press and from publishing articles or poetry for the duration of his prison term.